Welcome to CSP 340, Chapter 9, Autism Spectrum Disorders and Pervasive Developmental Disorders. Some facts about autism. Did you know that autism now affects 1 in 88 children, 1 in 54 boys? Autism prevalence figures are growing. Autism is the fastest growing serious developmental disability in the U.S. Boys are nearly 5 times more likely than girls to have autism, and there is no medical detection and there is no cure. Your textbook mentions that there would be a new set of definitions coming out before this textbook got published, and they were 100% correct. What we're looking at here is the DSM-5 definition of autism. DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual for the American Psychological Association. So here is what now is considered to be the definition of autism. First thing we look at is persistent deficits in social communication and social interactions. So what they talk about is deficits in social emotional reciprocity. So that's the give and take of a social relationship. Deficits in nonverbal communication used for social interaction. So in other words, being able to read body language and facial expressions. Deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. The next part is restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. Stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects, or speech. And we talked about this in a previous chapter, but stereotypical movement are things like hand flapping and finger flicking, and spinning and twirling. They also will have repetitive speech. We call that echolalia, where they will repeat things over and over again. One of the other words we use for this is perseveration, which means repeated either actions or verbal actions. Insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. So for children with autism, they want their food exactly the same every day. They want it arranged on the plate exactly the same. Or they may have a pattern where on Mondays they have to wear red. Very, very rigid about any changes in schedule or habits. Highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. They may have a hobby, or they may have an interest where that's all they do. You know people that for instance, love butterflies and everything in their house is butterflies. Take this to an extreme where all this child would want to learn about would be butterflies. All they would want to wear would be things with butterflies. And they would become very, very agitated and upset if they weren't allowed to focus on butterflies. Hyper or hypo-reactivity to sensory input and unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. One of the most interesting books that I've read about autism came out, probably 30 years ago, and it was written by a mother who was talking about her child, and it was written during the days when we really didn't know very much about autism. And this mother talked about how with her child, the way she described music that she liked was by how many rooms away it had to be for her to enjoy it. So if she really liked a song, she had to be 3 rooms away from it because she became overstimulated if she was in the room with something she liked. Very strange. This same child, you could drop a pan of dishes next to her and she wouldn't react at all. So they'll react to things that other people find very distressing in the environment, and they won't react to things that other people find distressing, but they may find distressing something that you may not even notice. And then other characteristics, the symptoms must be present in the early developmental period. A lot of sources say 2 to 3 years old. The symptoms must cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. So it can't be just that the person's weird. These disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability. And the reason they have this in here is because people with very low intellectual functioning have a lot of the same characteristics as a person with autism, but their entire characteristics are based on their lack of intellect, not on this, what we call autism. Now, this new definition combines Asperger's and autism, which used to be separate in the DSM. The DSM-4 had autism and Asperger's as two separate conditions. This new definition combines both of them together. So in your textbook, when they talk separately about autism and Asperger's and childhood disintegrative disorder and pervasive developmental disorders, all of those are now under the same category. So the next set of characteristics that we're going to look at is a triangle, and this triangle represents, I have to slide it a little bit so you can see it better, the combination of social interaction with communication and with activities and interests. So what we find is that the person appears to be unresponsive. They may have unusual eye contact, gestures, or expressions. They're not going to spontaneously share interest or enjoyment. They don't make friends with their peers, so that's all social interaction. Under communication, unusual or repetitive language. They can't initiate or sustain conversation. They have delayed or impoverished language. They don't play make-believe or pretend. And then under activities and interests, they have unusual repetitive gestures, rigid routines, fascinations with objects and parts, and preoccupation with narrow interests. But they may be skilled in some non-social domains. So let me tell you just briefly about my cousin. I have a cousin named Jim, and he has a son named Jacob. And Jacob, the only time I ever saw Jacob was when he was about 18 months old. And at that point, he was not walking. He not only was not talking, but he was completely silent. He didn't even make any noise at all, which was really creepy. He could take the those child-proof locks you have on a cabinet, he could take those off. He took clocks apart, but he couldn't feed himself. He couldn't dress himself. There was an oddness about him, and we were at a family gathering, and the older aunts and cousins, all were talking about what's wrong with Jacob. And at the time, his mom and dad just said, well, his sister was late walking and talking. Well, by the time he was about 5 years old, they had gotten a PDD diagnosis, pervasive developmental disorder. And by the time he was in third grade, they were using the word autism. Jacob had what your book talks about, where his skills actually got worse. So some things that he could do when he was 5, by the time he was 10, he couldn't do those things. He's in his 20s now, and he lives in a residential facility. His parents finally just couldn't keep him at home anymore. He doesn't talk. He does use sign language. He walks. In fact, he's a very active hiker. He played soccer when he was in high school, but he does not feed himself. He doesn't bathe himself. He doesn't dress himself. And he doesn't have what you would call friends. You may have heard about Jacob some years back. They were hiking on Dolly Sods, which is a mountain in West Virginia, and Jim and his wife were behind Jacob on the trail because they were in their 50s and Jacob was in his late teens, and he got ahead of them on the trail. They came around a curve and he was gone. And they called and they called and they called and they couldn't find him. And this was in October. It was during our fall break. And he was missing for 3 days. And the last day that they were looking for him, the weather was predicted to get very cold that night. And so everybody was very concerned about him, and they took the dogs out for one last try. The dogs had been out twice before, and they found him, and he was about 20 feet from the trail, and everybody had been calling and yelling for him, but see, he's nonverbal. And what he was doing is he was lying there, I mean, best we can tell because he doesn't communicate, but he was lying there waiting for somebody to come find him. He was in a pile of leaves. He'd made a pile of leaves to rest in. He was dehydrated. They had to carry him down the trail. And so that's the life of somebody with autism, is that the lack of, and this is, lower level autism, the lack of communication, the lack of ability to interact with others, lack of communication. Jacob loves soccer. He loves hiking. He'll spend all day out on the trail. They now have a special piece of equipment that was donated that tracks him. And so if he's missing, then his family can find him. I think it's a bracelet that tracks him. Okay, so now we're going to look at a couple of films about autism. We'll probably just have time for the first one, and then we'll go, I'll start a second film.
Right now, autism is typically diagnosed between 3 to 4 years old, but experts say it can be diagnosed as early as 12 months old in some kids. And research shows the earlier treatment starts, the better the result. So what are the symptoms of autism? What are we looking for? Here are some signs to keep in mind.
They weren't smiling when they were supposed to, or cooing. They couldn't take a bottle very well. Couldn't breastfeed.
By the time children are 8 to 10 to 12 months, they're actually quite social, and they're playing games like peekaboo. Or when you go up to them and you hold your hands out like this, they raise up and they're ready to get picked up.
Lacking eye contact is something that's a major thing.
He wasn't sitting up. He was very, very late to walk. He never pointed, and he was very, very late to speak.
She has a cousin who is a month younger. When we saw him at that Christmas, there was a huge difference. He was pointing and gesturing and talking, like showing people things that he liked, and she was doing none of that.
He didn't respond to his name. Typically, you call a 2-year-old by their name, and they respond.
He could count way beyond 100, at 20 months old, and just memorize things, but yet he couldn't look us in the eye and tell us anything.
We were waiting and waiting, thinking, oh, one day, he was just going to start speaking.
She will hug other kids and play maybe near them, but not necessarily interact with them.
About the first 6 months, he developed normally. He was sitting up on time, rolling over on time, and by about a year old, all of the mama, dada, all those things had disappeared, and we were noticing he didn't like to be held.
Do people with autism gain skills and then lose them? And the answer to that is about half do. Now, why that happens, we don't really know.
We'd run around the house with his hand like this, what we called the hand dance, I think, and he would go, like that, and he would run laps around the house like that.
We said, how are you doing today, Kevin? His response would be, how are you doing today, Kevin?
Young children might line up toys or organize things a certain way.
If you have a child that's not socially responsive, when you hold your hands up or when you point, they just don't respond. They don't look at your face, and their speech is all over the way. Now you have a collection of symptoms that are clustered together. You say, ooh, you gotta pay attention to this.
The diagnosis process is tricky. There's no blood test or brain scan to determine autism. That's where Easter Seals comes in.
First, parents can call Easter Seals for a free developmental screening.
So in the next film, we'll look at a few more videos on characteristics, and then we will look at what we're going to do about autism.